In 1918, British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon declared that the Allied victory in the Great War floated on a wave of oil. A massive fleet of steel warships burned crude oil instead of coal to dominate the high seas. Motorized tanks crushed trenches, and airplanes patrolled the skies, all powered by the same black liquid. Yet this substance began as a simple sticky annoyance that ancient civilizations used to waterproof their reed boats. What transformed this mundane sludge into the most dangerous geopolitical weapon on the planet? It was not a sudden discovery, but a slow, brutal process of industrial subjugation. History reveals that the modern world was not built on innovation, but on the extraction of a substance that governments would kill to control. Humans first encountered petroleum as bitumen, a thick, tar-like substance that seeped from the earth in ancient Mesopotamia. Workers in Babylon used this natural asphalt as mortar to bind bricks for their monumental structures. In the Euphrates River Valley, builders caulked their wooden vessels with the substance to keep the water out. Centuries later, in the 4th century, engineers of the Chinese Jin dynasty pioneered a different approach. They drilled deep into the ground using bamboo pipes to tap into subterranean natural gas deposits. They used this gas to boil brine and produce salt, turning a natural phenomenon into a manufacturing process. By the 10th century, travelers in Baku documented the active extraction of naphtha from surface seeps. Local populations collected the liquid for rudimentary lighting and as a primitive medicinal balm. This decision to harness the Earth's subterranean blood seemed small at the time. It was not. The scale of the industry shifted forever in the middle of the 19th century. In 1859, a retired railroad conductor named Edwin Drake arrived in Titusville, Pennsylvania. He faced ridicule from locals who watched him build a wooden derrick in a muddy field. He drove a cast-iron pipe into the ground to prevent the hole from collapsing under the pressure of the earth. On August 27th, his drill bit struck oil at a depth of 69.5 feet. The well produced 20 barrels of crude oil every single day. This proved that petroleum could be extracted systematically through drilling rather than waiting for surface leaks. The discovery sparked a frantic rush of investors and speculators into the Pennsylvania woods. Among them was a methodical bookkeeper from Cleveland named John D. Rockefeller. He observed the chaos of the oil fields and chose a different path toward total control. Rockefeller invested in his first refinery in 1863, focusing on the processing rather than the drilling. He understood that whoever refined the oil controlled the flow of the entire market. By 1870, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company to consolidate the fragmented industry. He used aggressive railroad rebates and predatory pricing to crush his competition. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. This massive monopoly dictated prices, crushed labor, and influenced legislation across the country. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The sheer scale of the monopoly eventually drew the gaze of federal regulators. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Standard Oil versus the United States. The court declared the company a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. They ordered the massive entity to be broken into 34 independent companies. This decision birthed the ancestors of modern giants like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. The breakup did not destroy the power of the industry, but merely decentralized the players. The thirst for the resource only grew as the 20th century dawned. In 1901, a prospector named Patillo Higgins and an engineer named Anthony F. Lucas drilled at Spindletop Hill in Texas. The earth erupted in a massive gusher that sprayed 100,000 barrels of oil per day. This single strike shifted the entire American energy landscape away from coal. It fueled the growth of new corporations like Gulf Oil and Texaco. The hunger for oil quickly crossed the borders of the Western world. William Knox D'Arcy, a British investor, secured a massive concession from the Shah of Persia. In 1908, his team struck oil in the remote region of Masjed Soliman. This discovery led to the formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP. The world had become addicted to a fuel that existed in only a few specific corners of the map. Nations realized that their military survival depended on maintaining access to these distant, oily veins. The reality was far darker than the promise of industrial progress. The commodity had become a force that dictated the rise and fall of empires. It turned nations into pawns in a global game of extraction and supply. By the time the world entered the mid-20th century, the era of the individual driller had ended. The age of the global cartel had arrived, and the stakes were higher than ever. Governments realized that the control of oil fields meant control of the future. The British Navy converted its entire fleet from coal to oil by 1914. Ships no longer required hundreds of men to shovel black rock into furnaces. Fuel lines replaced the grueling labor of the coal hole gangs. This change granted British vessels greater speed and longer range at sea. It also made the empire entirely dependent on oil from the Middle East. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company became the primary supplier for the Royal Navy. Winston Churchill defended this reliance as a strategic necessity for national survival. The reality was that the map of the world was being redrawn for pipelines. Boundaries were etched into the sand based on where the crude flowed. In 1928, the world's largest oil companies gathered in a Scottish castle. Executives from Shell, BP, and Standard Oil formed the Achnacarry Agreement. They secretly agreed to divide global markets and fix production levels. This cartel effectively ended the era of free market competition for oil. They acted as a private government that dictated the price of energy. Their influence stretched into the halls of every major world capital. The global economy became a mechanism for transporting refined hydrocarbons. Roads were paved with asphalt, a byproduct of the refining process. Suburbs expanded as the internal combustion engine replaced the horse and carriage. Oil companies financed the construction of highways to ensure high fuel consumption. The landscape of America shifted to accommodate the automobile above all else. This transformation was not a natural evolution of urban planning. It was a deliberate strategy to secure long-term demand for gasoline. In 1930, the East Texas oil field was discovered by Dad Joyner. The sheer volume of crude flooding the market crashed global prices. Governments intervened to restrict production and stabilize the corporate profits. The state and the corporation merged their interests in the oil patch. Conflict followed the pipeline routes across every continent. During the Second World War, oil dictated the movement of every army. German tanks stalled in the Russian winter for lack of fuel. The Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor to secure access to Dutch East Indies oil. The war was a struggle to capture or deny access to the wells. Victory was secured by the side that could move the most fuel to the front. After the war, the demand for petroleum accelerated beyond all historical precedent. Plastic manufacturing turned oil into the foundation of the modern consumer world. Everything from toothbrushes to medical equipment derived from the same crude source. Societies became addicted to a substance that existed in finite quantities. Geologists warned that the easy-to-reach reservoirs would eventually run dry. The industry responded by drilling into the ocean floor at impossible depths. Offshore platforms became symbols of human engineering and environmental risk. In 1969, a blowout at Platform A in the Santa Barbara Channel occurred. Millions of gallons of oil coated the beaches of Southern California. The disaster forced the public to look at the cost of their energy. New regulations emerged, but the dependency on the substance remained absolute. Nations formed blocs to leverage their control over the remaining reserves. The 1973 oil crisis proved how fragile the global supply chain really was. Gas stations ran dry, and lines of cars stretched for city blocks. The world realized that a decision in a distant desert could stop life at home. The petrodollar system emerged to anchor the global currency to oil. Financial markets rose and fell based on the daily price of a barrel. The substance had become the blood of the global financial system. Today, the infrastructure of the entire planet relies on this ancient sludge. The deep-sea wells continue to pump even as the atmosphere warms. The object in the viewer's hand is a product of this violent history. The plastic, the fuel, and the electricity all trace back to the derrick. The cycle of extraction continues despite the known consequences of the process. This is the legacy of the black liquid that reshaped the earth. The story of oil is a narrative of absolute power and total dependence. It is a history written in the bedrock of every industrial nation. The future remains tethered to the same wells that built the modern world. In 1918, Lord Curzon declared that the Allied cause floated to victory on a wave of oil. This observation turned a simple, dark liquid into the ultimate weapon of modern warfare. The world had not always viewed this substance as a strategic necessity. In ancient Babylon, residents gathered black bitumen seeping from the earth to waterproof their reed boats. They used the thick, tar-like residue to hold together the bricks of their massive ziggurats. Centuries later, during the Jin dynasty in China, laborers utilized bamboo pipes to transport natural gas. They burned the gas to evaporate brine and extract salt from deep underground deposits. These early uses were localized, small-scale, and entirely disconnected from global power. This decision to treat oil as a minor resource seemed logical at the time. It was not. By the mid-19th century, the demand for whale oil for lamps reached a breaking point. Whale populations plummeted, and the cost of lighting the night sky soared. Investors searched for a cheaper alternative that could burn in a lantern. In 1859, a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake arrived in Titusville, Pennsylvania. He rented a plot of land near a creek where oil bubbled to the surface. Locals mocked his efforts, calling his project Drake's Folly. He used a steam-powered drill to bore 69 feet into the hard rock. The ground groaned, and a dark, viscous liquid surged toward the surface. This was the first time a commercial well tapped directly into an underground reservoir. The world changed in that single, muddy moment. A young bookkeeper named John D. Rockefeller watched the chaos of the Pennsylvania oil rush. He saw the inefficiency of hundreds of small, competing drillers fighting for control. Rockefeller understood that the true profit lay not in the drilling, but in the refining. He founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870. He systematically acquired his competitors, often through aggressive price-cutting and secret rebates. Standard Oil dictated the price of kerosene to every merchant in the country. The company owned the pipelines, the refineries, and the rail cars that moved the product. Rockefeller built a vertical empire that left no room for independent operators to survive. He controlled 90% of the American oil market by the turn of the century. This monopoly became a blueprint for corporate dominance. The government finally took notice of his vast, unchecked power. In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil violated antitrust laws. The judges ordered the massive corporation to split into 34 distinct companies. The court intended to restore competition to the energy sector. Instead, the breakup created a new generation of competing giants. These entities grew into the multinational corporations that dominate the industry today. The transition from a small-scale commodity to a global necessity was complete. Nations began to prioritize the acquisition of oil fields above all other diplomatic goals. The substance was no longer just a fuel for lamps or a sealant for brick. It had become a geopolitical force that dictated the survival of sovereign states. The map of the 20th century was drawn by the location of these subterranean pools. Leaders in London, Berlin, and Washington viewed every drop of oil as a national asset. They invested in extraction projects across the Middle East and the Americas. The thirst for petroleum pushed engineers to drill in increasingly hostile environments. They built platforms in the middle of the ocean and pipelines across frozen tundras. Every mile of steel pipe laid in the sand shifted the balance of power. The reality was that the world had locked itself into a permanent dependence. This addiction forced governments to align their policies with the interests of energy conglomerates. The history of the 20th century was a record of this invisible black current. Every major conflict mirrored the struggle to control the flow of crude. Armies moved on wheels and tracks that required a constant supply of refined oil. Without the pipeline, the modern industrial state ceased to function. The legacy of Titusville expanded into a web that covered every continent on the globe. The humble seep of the Babylonian marshes had become the heartbeat of civilization. Corporations managed the supply, but the earth set the terms of the extraction. The scale of this operation defied human comprehension. Billions of barrels moved through the dark veins of the global infrastructure every day. The oil industry transformed the physical landscape of every industrial nation. Cities expanded outward, built around the assumption of cheap, abundant fuel. The entire architecture of the modern world relied on the consistency of the supply. This reliance created a fragile system that could collapse with a single disruption. The history of the substance was a story of rapid, uncontrolled escalation. It was a cycle of discovery, monopoly, conflict, and total integration. The oil remained the primary driver of the global economy even as the environment changed. The path from the first bamboo pipe to the modern offshore derrick was paved with power. The world had not yet found a way to decouple itself from the well. The global dominance of the Seven Sisters appeared unshakable for decades. These massive Western corporations set production levels and fixed prices across the globe. Their boardrooms functioned as a private, shadow government for the energy sector. This arrangement seemed to guarantee stability for the industrial world. It did not. In September 1960, representatives from Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela gathered in Baghdad. They formed the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. The goal was to reclaim control over their own subterranean resources. For 13 years, the cartel and the new organization maneuvered for leverage. The breaking point arrived in October 1973. Following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, Arab nations imposed a total oil embargo. Ships sat idle in ports and gas stations across the United States ran dry. Prices soared from $3 a barrel to nearly $12 in a matter of months. The global economy shuddered under the weight of the sudden scarcity. This decision to weaponize a commodity changed the nature of international diplomacy forever. The reality was far darker than the public realized. In 1974, the United States Senate convened the Church Committee to investigate the crisis. Documents surfaced revealing that the Seven Sisters had coordinated their activities for years. The companies operated a secret global cartel to fix prices and stifle competition. Their public rhetoric regarding free markets vanished under the scrutiny of the investigators. The world learned that its energy supply was never a product of simple supply and demand. It was the result of calculated, private manipulation. The physical cost of this obsession soon spilled into the open. On January 28, 1969, an offshore drilling rig exploded off the coast of Santa Barbara. Roughly 100,000 barrels of crude oil surged into the Pacific Ocean. Black sludge coated the pristine beaches and suffocated the local marine life. The sight of dying birds and oil-slicked sand shocked the American public. This disaster served as the catalyst for the modern environmental movement. Legislators rushed to pass the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970. Yet, the reliance on the blackcurrant remained absolute. The systems of power had grown too large to dismantle. On March 24, 1989, the tanker Exxon Valdez struck Bligh Reef in Alaska. 10.8 million gallons of crude oil poured into Prince William Sound. The disaster decimated the local ecosystem and cost billions in cleanup efforts. It stood as a grim testament to the volatility of the global infrastructure. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 followed, but the dependence on the well endured. Each new extraction project pushed further into the fragile edges of the planet. Nations continued to align their military strategies with the location of the reservoirs. The internal veins of the world remained filled with the same dark, viscous liquid. The geography of the modern state was still defined by the reach of the pipeline. You flip a switch and the lights flicker to life without a second thought. You drive your car and assume the fuel will always be waiting in the tank. The history of oil is not a story of the past. It is the invisible, pulsing foundation of your current life. You are living inside the machine that the world built to keep the flow moving. The cycle that began in the marshes of Babylon never ended. It simply grew until it covered you.